Hey, what's going on? So I want to ask a question and talk about this topic because I'm sure that if you have been looking at the news or really anything, you just probably hear Bitcoin this and crypto that, blockchain, smart contracts, Ethereum, all of this lingo, and you might already know something about it, or even if you don't really have any sort of technical understanding of what's going on, you've probably heard about these terms that have been thrown around. And everyone's been, it seems like, either really excited about crypto and Bitcoin or they're really cynical about it. But either way, it tends to evoke an emotional response, which I think is interesting. But I just wanted to come on here and share some of my thoughts. And because I've been looking into it as well, I've been doing some research, I've been reading some books during some of my free time. Most of my time I've been spent just working and focusing on marketing, but in the time that I do have to read and things like that, I've been reading up and researching on blockchain, crypto, smart contracts, Bitcoin, Ethereum, things like that. So just wanted to share my perspective, and especially considering that this is a really interesting topic because I find that crypto combines math with computer science, economics, game theory, even some political science as well. If you consider some topics like voting theory and things like that, which I'll talk about all these things. And I'm not really going to get into the weeds here. I'm not going to go too technical. I'm going to keep it pretty high level so that even if you don't have a background in all this stuff and you just want to understand what all the hype is about, I'm just going to give you some context here so you can actually have some working understanding of what all this is. So the reason why this came up, or another reason, is because I saw an interview with the founder of Ethereum, or he was actually the inventor of Ethereum, because there's 8 co-founders, but he was actually the one that invented the idea behind Ethereum. And I'll talk about why Ethereum is so important as well, and what all this blockchain stuff is as well. But in that interview, he was on Bloomberg, and the reporter asked him, is crypto the future or is it just a fad? And I thought that was such an interesting question, but his response was even more interesting, where he basically said, I think it's the future, but it contains fads. So if you really think about that, I thought that was the perfect response, because really, from my perspective, Web 3.0 it's such an apt description of what this is, because I believe that crypto is the biggest innovation since the internet and social media. Hands down. This is something that is going to shift basically the way we do things. And honestly, the funny thing is we're all excited about it now, but in 10 years, 20 years from now, we're probably going to be like, oh yeah, blockchain this, blockchain that. Like, we're not even going to think about, it's just going to be interwoven into our lives, kind of like how the internet is now. Like, I could get excited about the internet, but most likely you're probably just like, yeah, well, what are you so excited about? It's just, we use this all the time. And I'm sure that's what blockchain will be eventually. But at the moment, I think people are just excited about it because it's the new technology, and kind of like how when the internet really got big with some of these websites, where it became more accessible to create your own online business, and people were just buying up these domain names like pets.com and things like that. During the 90s, that's when we kind of had a bubble, like all this excitement, and usually this is what happens. It's kind of like, it happens all throughout history. It's like the California gold rush, right? Even back then, before all this online stuff, there was a few people who struck gold in California, and all these people flocked to California. They were staking their claims. They had like a little piece of land that they would stake for themselves and try to mine, and everyone was so excited about it. The truth is, though, that only about maybe 2% of these people actually struck gold, and 98% gave up their lives, but they didn't really have anything to show for it. Same thing happened with the internet. All these people were going all in on their online businesses, but 98% of them got wiped out. But the thing is, the 2%, or some percentage of that 2%, there were players like Amazon and Google and Facebook that emerged from the ashes of basically evolved into what they are today. So here's the thing, is that the same sort of thing is happening with cryptocurrencies, with NFTs, and all these things, where there's a lot of excitement around it. And I think it gets to the point where it's like a game of telephone. The early adopters really understand the technology around it, and they get excited about it because they can see how this can change the world. And they, it gets passed on to secondhand people where they're like, oh, they're also excited about it, and then the third-hand people and the fourth-hand people, and eventually it's like a game of telephone where now you have like people out here who are hearing about it and they're getting excited, but they don't even know why they're excited anymore. I'm actually seeing this quite a bit when I'm watching people's videos or listening to people on podcasts or reading books. Well, mostly just listening to people talk about these things. Even people who are very well informed in the financial space, who understand stocks and real estate really well, with the crypto and blockchain knowledge that's going around, it's sort of secondhand, third-hand knowledge, I feel like. Now, I've really tried to make an endeavor to basically study as much firsthand primary sources as I can, which usually comes in the form of either interviews with the founders themselves or just reading books. And I find that that's usually probably the closest to the truth. You can't really get to the core of the truth unless you're speaking to the founder face to face, or you're actually working on the project yourself. But this is, I feel like, the closest that I can really get to it in I suppose, like a reasonable way, without me giving up my life and moving to Switzerland or something like that. So anyway, getting back to the point here, I also see exactly that sort of thing. It is the future, and it contains fads. So we're moving in this direction where blockchain is going to be the underlying infrastructure for the way we do exchange. And I'll talk more about that in a second. But let me actually talk about the context here of why Bitcoin became such a big thing. Because like I said, I've been looking into different things and really trying to find out what is behind all of this. And if we go back to 2008, you might remember there was the recession and the financial crisis and the housing crisis and the housing bubble. And a lot of it came from that because before Bitcoin, there were actually other forms of digital currency that were using similar technology. They just didn't catch on because the timing wasn't necessarily appropriate for society to really adopt it. But it's kind of like when you're trying to start a fire and you keep trying to spark it, and eventually it catches, but it has to have the right conditions. And when it came to around that period of time, around 2008, the conditions were really ripe for financial change. We were just coming out of the 2008 financial crisis, where, let me just give you a quick little macroeconomic summary here of how that went down, because I think that'll better inform why this is so important. So once again, I don't want to get too lost into the details here, but high level understanding of 2008 financial crisis, there's basically a housing bubble. And here's the thing that comes with political incentives as well, is a lot of times political incentives are aligned in such a way where the people who are in office have an incentive to want to stay in office. So they want to make sure that the economy looks like it's thriving while they're in office. Now, this can cause a lot of conflict because the natural cycle macroeconomically, and when I say macroeconomically, I just mean in terms of how the economy looks as a whole, when it comes to, especially from a public policy standpoint. So we have what Joseph Schumpeter, he's an economist who basically talked about business cycles. And there's a natural pattern to business cycles where you have a rise and then it starts to plateau a bit, then it declines, but each time it declines, it doesn't dip as far as it did previously, and it kind of goes up like that. And that's how Joseph Schumpeter talks about business cycles happening. It's kind of like, I talked about this in earlier videos as well, about Hegel talks about how history unfolds in a sort of corkscrew-like pattern, calls it the historical dialectic. But basically, you have thesis and antithesis, and then in the middle, you come out with synthesis. And so you might move from thesis to antithesis, then you sort of meet in the middle, and then you go into the next revolution. And it kind of spirals upwards. So anyway, that's a brief overview of how the business cycles naturally go. So typically, every approximately 10 years, we should see an economic correction, a downturn, a recession of some sort. Not necessarily a recession, but at least a correction, right? So maybe from 1999 to 2008, we saw that course where we had the dot-com bubble, and that essentially led to an economic correction. And then 2008, there was a financial crisis. That was a recession. And then now 2020, there should really be a correction of some sort, but a lot of it has been artificially inflated in a sense where the government, so here's the thing, is that the Federal Reserve has multiple levers to pull when it comes to monetary policy. They can lower interest rates, they can print more money, and there's also fiscal policy initiatives that can also increase GDP and stimulation of the economy. And one of those things is like a stimulus check, for example, a stimulus package. And so the reason I'm talking about all this is because there's this general mistrust around that period of time, around 2008, because basically what was happening is the interest rates were really low because the political incentives, of course, the people that are in office want to stay in office, so they want to make sure that the economy looks good. And what sometimes they'll do is they'll lower the interest rate so that the price of borrowing money becomes lower. So think about it this way. Let's say that you want to buy a house and the house costs $100,000. I'm just going to use round numbers here just to keep it easy. And so you want, or the down payment on the house is $100,000. You come to me and you ask me, hey, can I borrow $100,000 for this house? And I say, I'll loan you the money, but you're going to have to pay me back $110,000. So basically an extra $10,000 on top of that. That's the cost of borrowing the money, right? So you're like, okay, cool. And that's basically a $100,000 loan with 10% interest. Now, what happened during that time is, in order to continue to stimulate the economy, because there was essentially, it looked like there was going to be a recession, but things were being artificially propped up by this housing market, which people were saying, oh no, it's going to continue to just keep going up, right? But the truth was that because interest rates were so low, people were just borrowing money. Even people that were not so creditworthy, that were not so trustworthy with the money, they're just borrowing money. They're buying houses that they couldn't necessarily afford, and they would make maybe a couple of payments on it, and they would default on their payments, basically meaning that they couldn't make any more payments, and the loan would go bad. They couldn't actually fulfill on that promise, and they would declare bankruptcy. The home would go into foreclosure, and there's a lot of issues there. And you can see that there's going to be issues with that sort of system happening. And here was the issue on the back end of things, is that the financial institutions at the time, the investment banks, Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, Morgan Stanley, they had securities, these assets that they're holding. And the way that they were securing these assets at that time, because it looked like the housing market was booming, they were backing up their securities with mortgages, with people's mortgages, right? Now you could probably see where this is like a train wreck about to happen. If all these people who can't really afford to buy homes are taking out loans to put down payments to make their dreams come true of being a homeowner, but they can't really afford it, like let's say they only have maybe 2 months worth of payments that they can actually make, you can see that this is about to be a train wreck, because as soon as they miss their payments and as soon as they have to declare bankruptcy and the home gets seized, then, or the home goes into foreclosure, then all these mortgage-backed securities go bad. Now, here's how the financial institutions got away with it, is they would take these mortgage-backed securities and they would do something called diversifying it, where they repackage it, they slice it up, repackage it, because theoretically, diversification should decrease risk, right? If you have a basket of goods, let's say you have very risky assets, you have moderately risky assets, and you have very safe assets that you know are going to produce a return, that are strong assets. If you mix them all together, then theoretically, on average, it should just be maybe like a steady upward trend, or at least if you lose, then you're not losing that badly, right? So that's the whole point of diversification, is to lower risk or to control for risk. Now that's basically what the financial institutions were saying that they were doing with these derivatives, and then they would also repackage the derivatives as credit default swaps, is what they're called. And now you have super diversified assets. And here's the issue though, is that the financial institutions were going to ratings agencies or ratings institutions, because there are certain institutions that will rate how solid an asset is. They'll rate how good an asset is. Usually it's like an A, B, C, etc. sort of scale. And one example is Moody's, and they would rate these assets. And I can't remember exactly how they were able to be persuaded, and I don't know if there's actual exact details on that, but from my understanding, it was very unethical how they were persuading these rating institutions to actually get away with. Basically, they were convincing these rating institutions that these were good assets because they were highly diversified. But the question is, did these rating institutions actually know, like maybe there were certain incentives financially that were under the table that also led to these rating institutions rating these assets at a very high level. But regardless of whatever the case is, you could see how this is an issue. Because even with diversified assets, if the majority of all these assets, of these mortgage-backed securities, are going to go bad, it's kind of like, and this is going to be a somewhat disgusting analogy, I apologize, but I'm just going to make this analogy because this is kind of like how it was. It's almost like if you took a dead rat. Let's say I own a restaurant and I'm a chef, and I took a dead rat and I just cut it up and I rearrange the parts. That's like a derivative made up of bad, toxic assets, mortgage-backed securities. And if I repackage those derivatives, like I chop it up again and I reformulate it, I still have a dead rat. Just because I repackage and rearrange the pieces doesn't necessarily make it a good thing. I'm just taking bad ingredients and I'm just rearranging it and I'm serving it to you. That's basically what was happening, but with the ratings institutions, they were saying, oh no, but you repackaged it and you repackaged it again, so it must be a good asset because it's diversified. Anyway, long story short, basically these assets turned toxic is what they said. And as soon as all these assets went bad, then the Federal Reserve had to step in and decide what to do here. Because here's the problem, is naturally, if these are small, medium-sized companies, you would just let them fail because, you know, they made bad decisions, poor decisions, unethical decisions along the way that have gotten them to the place where they are now, or back then where they were, and they put themselves in compromised positions. That was really on them. That was their responsibility. The problem was that, you might have heard this back then, they were too big to fail, these financial institutions. Basically meaning that they were so interconnected with the global financial markets that the Federal Reserve was concerned that if they were allowed to fail, then the global financial market would completely collapse, interfering with international markets as well. That was the big fear behind this. So they had to make a decision. Do we bail out these financial institutions or do we let them fail? And what they decided was we should just bail them out because they're too big to fail. If we let them fail, then the global financial markets will collapse and that'll be on us. So they didn't want to take on that. I mean, if you really think about it, if you're in that position, then, I mean, it's easy to say, oh, just let them fail. But when you're on the verge of global economic collapse, that's a lot of pressure. So that was the decision that they took, is to bail these banks out. Unfortunately, a lot of these people that worked at these banks were laid off. They had all their life savings as stocks in the company themselves, and investment bankers worked super hard, especially at these A-list investment banks as well. So a lot of them just like lost their jobs and their life savings, and they were working 120-hour weeks before that as investment bankers and just lost everything. So anyway, I'm going really in depth here, I know, but I just wanted to provide some context because this was the impetus behind Bitcoin and why it started to catch on. Because like I said, the technology was already there, but the political and socioeconomic climate wasn't really ripe until around 2008 when all this happened. And actually before this as well, in Argentina, there was a bank panic, basically meaning that there was an issue where the banks were over leveraged. There was also really high inflation rates, and people were trying to take money out of the banks, but the banks actually didn't have enough money within the bank to actually give out give out the cash to the customer, to the bank, people who banked with them. And you might be asking yourself, okay, well, how does that happen? Well, the truth is that that would also be similar if there was an FDIC in the US, because that's basically what happened in the US back in the Great Depression. That's what happened. Because I don't know if most people understand this, and you shouldn't feel bad if you don't understand this either, because it took me a while to really understand that banks, they actually don't hold all of the money at that bank. So if you have, let's say, $10,000 in your bank account, and let's say you have 100 people that have $10,000 in their bank accounts at a Bank of America, for example. So 100 people times 10,000, that would be $1 million, right? So that bank should have $1 million in that bank, logically speaking, right? You would think that they would have $1 million at that bank if 100 people have put in $10,000 into that bank. But the truth is that they might only hold $100,000 at that bank. So if all 100 people went to that bank, wanted to take out all their $10,000 out of that bank, the bank wouldn't have enough money to do that. Why? Well, because the way banks make money is they loan out the money that you deposit into the bank to other people. And so they make money off of the interest. I don't know if most people realize that, but that's how banks work. And so, but the reason why that doesn't happen now in the US is because there's FDIC, which means that all banks in the US are backed by the federal government or the Federal Reserve. So if there was an issue where people were all trying to take out their money at the same time, then the Federal Reserve would step in and be able to give money to that bank temporarily to cover those, to cover that cash flow. But anyway, so quick little economics lesson there. But that happened in Argentina, where everyone was trying to take out money because banks were over leveraged, like they were giving out too much money. And it was also because the rising inflation too. So you might think like, why were banks being that dumb to just hand out all the money? Part of it was actually because of the inflation as well, was rapidly increasing at an unexpected rate. So once again, all these financial issues gave rise to this movement of we should no longer trust these banks. We should have a way of, or a form of currency that is completely decentralized, meaning that it's not controlled by any sort of financial institution. We can't trust the banks. We can't trust the government. We need a form of currency that is completely separate, that is objective, that is not owned by a company, that's not owned by a financial institution, that's not owned by the government. We need a way to control this that's, once again, it's like completely fair and objective, right? And that's basically what Bitcoin is. So that's the political impetus behind Bitcoin, is it is decentralized. And you can trade peer-to-peer, basically meaning that I can trade with you, even if you live in China, I live here in the US. And we could trade very quickly, theoretically. We could just trade almost in an instant. Well, for Bitcoin transactions, it's actually more than an instant. It's like at least 10 minutes or over. But I'll talk more about that in a second as well. And it's also completely secure, and you don't have to deal with any middlemen. You totally cut out the middleman. So a lot of the idea behind Bitcoin gained traction in the libertarian sort of landscape. A lot of libertarians, really extreme libertarians and sometimes even anarchists, really took on to this movement. It was starting to gain a bit of momentum underground around that period of time. I actually heard about Bitcoin for the first time in 2011 because it was either that you were an extreme libertarian or you were just a nerd that you would have heard about Bitcoin back then. Because my roommate at the time was a physics major, I was a math major in college, and I remember he just made some offhand remark about you should just buy a bunch of Bitcoin, and I was like, what's Bitcoin? He's like, it's going to be the future of money. And he was kind of joking. He was just like laughing about it. I wonder if he actually did invest in Bitcoin or bought some Bitcoin back then, but be curious to know that. But anyway, I looked it up and I thought about buying it, but it's actually like pretty difficult to buy back then. It wasn't, you didn't just download an app and buy some. It was actually a process to actually buy some Bitcoin back then. So, but anyway, let me talk a little bit about how Bitcoin works as well, just to give you a non-technical explanation. Maybe I could explain more technically in another piece of content that I put out eventually. But to give you a high-level non-technical explanation of it, the main issue or the main problem that this solves, number one, is the decentralized aspect of this. And another analogy that I gave to a friend where I was trying to describe the importance of this, we were basically talking about, well, I brought up, it's kind of like if you think about taxis 20 years ago, right? 20 years ago, if you wanted to get someplace, you'd either take the bus or you would call up a taxi. Would you do that now? Maybe in some places you would. But more than likely, you would probably just pull up an app called Uber and you would call an Uber. And by calling, I don't actually mean calling. You just enter in, you just push a few buttons and a car shows up. And it's just way more convenient. It feels a lot more secure and trusted and just a lot easier. I think the biggest thing is really convenience. But why did that happen? Why aren't we still just using taxis as the default mode of transportation? And you might still use taxis, but I'm just saying, in general, the general population tends to use Uber. Why is that the case now? And I think number one is the convenience, and then also it's a peer-to-peer network. It's basically connecting one person with another, and it's a much more efficient and effective way of making that transportation happen, right? In a similar way with Airbnb as well. Now, these platforms are not completely decentralized because they're owned by companies. They're owned by Airbnb and by Uber. But the peer-to-peer aspect, it has also gained traction in our society as well. So that's another reason why this foundation or the climate right now is really ripe for cryptocurrency. So it's peer-to-peer, it's decentralized. The biggest issue, especially when it comes to money, is what? The biggest issue is security. How do I know that if I try to send some money to you across the world that it's going to be a secure transaction? How do I know it's not going to be double counted? How do I know that there's not going to be errors in the system? How do we know it's completely secure? That was the biggest issue, and that's the biggest problem that blockchain technology solves, is how do we make this fast, secure, and validated, basically. So they're still working on the fast part of it, and the security as well as scalability is also another problem that's being worked on. But the idea behind the original blockchain technology is anytime that we transact, it's recorded. It's a recorded transaction on the ledger, right? So basically, if there's a transaction, then I'm trying to keep it as high level as possible, but there's a hash function that takes that transaction and turns it into a string, basically meaning that it's recorded as code. And the only way to decode it is to actually just guess and check. So it's actually really hard to break this code. And this is actually how most public key cryptography works anyway. It's just applied in this context of money. But anyway, the whole point is it's hard to crack the code because the only way you can crack it is by guessing and checking. There's no pattern to the code, and it's 256. It's like a 256 digit code in terms of where it's encoded, and also if you think about the combinations that are possible with that string of code, it's really difficult to try to crack that just by guessing and checking. You would need a serious computer to be able to crack that code. Now, what is done in order to validate these transactions is because we don't have a company that has a security team that can basically check these transactions, we don't have any sort of third party except people who are completely neutral. And they're called miners. They check the transactions. And they're doing this they can't do it on a regular computer. They're doing they're checking these transactions on supercomputers, and they're guessing and checking all these all the transactions to make sure that they are proper and aligned. And I guess you might be wondering, well, why would they do this, right? What is the incentive for them to do this? Well, they're rewarded in the coin, right? So if they're mining Bitcoin, then they receive Bitcoin in return if they're able to validate a transaction successfully. And it takes quite a bit of work to validate these transactions. And there are certain requirements in order to receive that reward. So before you go out and become a miner, it's actually pretty difficult to just start up a mining operation. And there's only, I think, a few major nodes in the world that are actually doing mining because it requires a ton of computational power. You need specialized equipment to do this. And in order to receive the reward, you need to have at least mined 1 megabyte of whatever blockchain that you're mining on. And then also it's somewhat random as well. So you're not just going to receive the cryptocurrency for every single validated transaction. So yeah, it's a big operation, but it does work. And now there are a couple of obstacles that come up because number one, if it requires that much computational power, it's not the greatest thing for the environment. And also number two, it takes a while to do this, right? So if I go to the grocery store and I try to pay in Bitcoin, let's say they accept Bitcoin. If I try to pay in Bitcoin, it would take at least 10 minutes to validate that transaction. So I'm just going to be holding up the line, just standing there waiting for the transaction to go through. So that's another problem that's being tackled right now with crypto, with a lot of these cryptocurrencies. Is that they're trying to figure out how to scale in such a way where transactions will require less computational power on the blockchain, and then also that they'll be able to increase the throughput of transactions, basically meaning that they're able to increase the number of transactions per second to make sure that this goes faster than at least 10 minutes per transaction. So anyway, that's a high-level explanation of blockchain. So Bitcoin, that's basically what Bitcoin is. The only issue, once again, is that it's such a prohibitively slow time to do those transactions that Bitcoin is really just good for a store of value at the moment. Now, what is Ethereum? Because honestly, for me, I see, okay, Bitcoin's great, but Ethereum takes things to another level. And I don't know if people realize this yet, but Vitalik Buterin, he was basically, his family was immigrated from Russia to Canada, and he grew up in Canada and was just this gifted child, and started writing about Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies when he was in high school. And that's when he came up with this idea for smart contract technology in Ethereum. And he didn't call it smart contracts back then, but that was the idea behind it, I believe. Yeah, I don't think he actually coined that term until, I think someone else coined the term, but he came up with the idea when he wrote the Ethereum white paper. And basically, here's the idea with smart contracts. If you have the blockchain, it's kind of like an iOS or an operating system. It's like iOS or Windows, something like that. It's like, okay, great. That's a great innovation. But what can we do with that? We need to be able to build apps on this operating system for it to really be of much use to us. Because think about it. Like, let's say you have iOS 10, or if you have Windows. I actually don't even know what the current operating systems are. But let's say you have an operating system that you're using on your computer. What good is it if you can't go on to Google Chrome, or if you don't have any sort of internet browser, if you don't have anything to be able to access, you don't have Word or Pages or Keynote or PowerPoint. What good is your computer without the apps? So what the smart contract is, it's essentially code that is put on the blockchain that allows you to build apps on the blockchain. Because the question that Buterin was asking himself was, okay, this technology is amazing. I can see how it's going to change the world, because this will revolutionize how currency is exchanged in a completely decentralized, peer-to-peer secure way. Why can't we take that same technology and apply it to other things? One application, for example, is like in real estate with mortgages and contracts. Another application is with the voting system. There's a multitude of applications, and we still haven't really dove deep yet. I'm sure there's going to be more and more companies out there that are going to continue to use smart contract technology and find applications that we don't even know about yet, and be able to leverage the blockchain and smart contracts in order to innovate. But yeah, voting is one thing, and mortgages. Also, there's another one that just came to mind that I just slipped my mind actually. But there's a variety of use cases for smart contracts. And what a smart contract is, the way to describe it once again at a high level, it's kind of like a vending machine, right? Because you could use this blockchain technology with the cryptography that's involved, and it provides a framework to build an app on top of this blockchain. And so it's like a vending machine where, let's say, as a supplier, I put in a soda into the vending machine and I leave. You could come along, and if you wanted to purchase that soda, I don't have to be there. You could come along, you could punch in a number, you can put in your money, you could retrieve your soda, and then you can leave, and then I can come and collect the money, and the transaction is fulfilled. And we could do that completely decentralized. And we could do it not just with money, but for items. We could exchange items. We could really exchange anything. I could sign a contract, I could leave, and then you can come and sign the contract. It's completely secure. There's no third party involved, and it's totally secure on the blockchain. That is the innovation of smart contracts, of dApps, of basically what Ethereum is able to do. Now, one step beyond that is, what are NFTs? NFTs are tokens And tokens basically they can be stored on a smart contract. So now we're building on top of each of these things, right? So with NFTs, it stands for non-fungible token, which means that it cannot be interchanged for something else. So for example, let's say if I have a $1 bill, you have a $1 bill. They're completely fungible, meaning that I can exchange, if they are completely arbitrary $1 bills, they're just normal $1 bills, I can exchange my $1 bill for your $1 bill, and I'll be totally fine with that. I'm like, okay, it's the same value. But what if instead I had a first edition baseball card that has never been reprinted? It's unique. There's only one of them that exists in the world, and it's worth $1 million. I would not trade this baseball card for that $1 bill. It's non-fungible. I actually wouldn't trade it for any other baseball card. If this is, let's say, the most valuable baseball card in the world, and it's not found anywhere else, right? So the whole idea is that it's completely unique. That means it's non-fungible. So fungibility is basically interchangeability with something else. So now you get into another layer of application here, because if you think about it, this will revolutionize the way that intellectual property happens. Intellectual property basically meaning that it's like copyrights, right? Is one example of intellectual property. I could make a piece of digital art. You see this happening a lot right now with NFTs. I can make a piece of digital art. I could put it on the blockchain as an NFT, and I own the rights to it. No one can copy it. Before, this would be a process, right? You'd have to probably go through some intellectual property attorney and make sure that you have the trademarks for it and things like that. Now you can completely do that on your own. Artists or musicians, they can have an NFT for their songs or for their albums, and they don't have to go through an agent. They're removing the middleman. That's the entire idea behind blockchain. Removing the middleman. It started with removing financial institutions and banks from the process. And now we're applying this to the world at large. Where else can we remove the middleman? Maybe, even with going back to the financial context, I know entrepreneurs who I know personally actually that they've been having issues with certain payment processors withholding large sums of money because it takes a while for them to validate the transactions. With the blockchain, you don't have to worry about that. It would just take as much time as it takes to validate the transaction for it to go through. You don't have to worry about a payment processor holding all this money, all this cash, right? As soon as a validator comes in, they validate the transaction, it's good to go. You don't have to deal with these third-party payment processors. It's a major problem that's solving. So yeah, that's basically it. And there was one other thing I was going to add as well when it came to cryptocurrency, because we talked about Bitcoin, we talked about Ethereum, and I think some of the biggest issues that are being solved right now are scalability, basically meaning how are you able to get more users in such a way where you're able to make sure that everything stays secure, because that is an issue that you have sufficient throughput with your transactions, that you're able to maintain the rate at which transactions happen. Speed is a huge issue right now. So some things are being changed with this sort of technology. One thing is moving from proof of work. So the whole thing that I was talking about with miners validating these transactions, that process is called proof of work. And a lot of these cryptocurrencies, Ethereum, Cardano also recently switched over to a new system, and it's called proof of stake. And it's sort of like proof of work, except instead of having miners, you have entities called validators. And because one issue that comes up with proof of work is that you basically have mining pools. And it's actually, the barriers to entry to start mining, a mining operation, are quite high, which means that you only have a few pools, you only have a few nodes, and if they collectively got together and they owned 51% of the mining operations, then here's how game theory comes into this. If you have one entity owning 51% of the mining operations, they could let through invalid transactions, and that's an issue. Because, yeah, then they're actually controlling the economy of the blockchain. And now it's centralized, so that's a huge issue. So the way that's solved is with proof of stake. It requires, number one, a lot less computational power to be a validator, because what you're doing instead is you're putting down kind of like a deposit of that cryptocurrency. Let's say I'm an Ethereum validator, then I would put down a stake. I would put down some Ethereum or Ether, and I would start validating transactions, and I could do this on my computer. I don't have to have a huge mining operation to do that. And so that allows the validation process to be more spread out, which should increase throughput. And then it also decentralizes things more. But there's also other cryptocurrencies that are trying to find different solutions for this. Algorand is another example of that, where they have a different form of governance. So this is where there's and you can tell just from everything that I've been talking about, there's math involved, there's cryptography, that's a branch of mathematics, and then you have computer science involved, then you have economics involved, and you have game theory, which is a branch of economics involved. So it's essentially an intersection of math, computer science, political science a little bit, and also economics, of how this all interplays, and it's really interesting. But anyway, I'll just keep it at that. But overall, I'm sure you could already tell that I'm quite excited about this. And I'm not saying that you have to invest in anything. You could just learn about it. I invite you to consider at least just educating yourself on some of these things if you want to. You don't have to. Because I think overall what's going to happen anyway is that we're just going to adopt this, kind of like how we did it with the internet. And you don't really have to understand how the internet works to use it. You could just use it. I just find it interesting to understand the inner workings of all of this stuff. And yeah, sometimes it gives rise to certain opportunities down the line, and having this baseline understanding is really helpful to be able to spot certain opportunities, or to be able to add value in, if you're working for a company right now, then potentially you could use this to add value to your company. Or if you're an entrepreneur, then you could use this to maybe even start a business around blockchain technology, smart contract technology, etc. Or if you are a professional of some sort, then you could think about how to incorporate these technologies into your practice. So anyway, that's pretty much it. I could talk further about the details about some of these things and some of the ways that these different blockchains are approaching some of these problems. One of them is interoperability, because you see all these cryptocurrencies out there, they can't really correspond with each other right now. And there are some cryptocurrencies that are really focused on that. Some are focused on getting faster transaction times, like Solana, for example, is one that's really focused on that. Yeah. And then also just better systems of what's called governance, which is where a lot of the game theory comes into play. Because the reason why I keep talking about game theory is, in order to make some of these decisions in a decentralized way, the question is, how do you do that if you don't have a president, or if you don't have a company making these decisions? How do you do it autonomously in a democratic way with all the users of that currency? And that's where you have to program into the currency itself a way of making these decisions with voting and things like that with the people who actually hold the currency. And it has to happen automatically and seamlessly and almost instantly in order for it to be usable. So anyway, those are just some thoughts. Is it the future or is it a fad? I agree with Vitalik Buterin, and I think he said it beautifully. I think it's the future and it contains fads. And that's it. Talk to you later.